think this will be better. A very warm welcome to the second public event of this academic year organized by the Department of Art History at Leiden. After a successful Van de Waal lecture by Renske Koon ter Vaart on a coming show on futurism in Kruller-Müller, we have now the launch of the latest book of Leopoldine Prosperetti's Woodland Imagery in Northern Art. The book is beautifully published by Lund Humphries in a wonderful series of Walter Melian, Northern Lights. And the book is not only a splendid art historical study on the intersection between the histories of art, poetry, and ecology, it is also exceptionally well written. It was a true pleasure having the book with me during the beautiful summer we had. First, Leopoldine will introduce her book. Then we have Joost Keizer as a reference, reflecting on the book and placing it in a larger context of current research in the early modern period. And you can get your questions. You can put your questions in the chat. We will pick them up at the end of this presentation. Let me first introduce Leopoldine Prosperetti to you. She is an independent scholar living in Baltimore, an art historian, initially educated at the University of Utrecht. She pursued a career at the Walters Art Museum. She obtained her PhD in the Department of the History of Art at Johns Hopkins University in 2003. She has taught as an adjunct professor at the University of Maryland, Cultural College, Towson University, and the Catherine McGovern School of the Arts at the University of Houston. Leopoldine has published widely on the art of Jan Bruegel, the Elder, and more generally on the vision of natural imagery in Northern European art. Her book, Landscape and Philosophy in the Art of Jan Bruegel the Elder, was published in 2009, and she co-edited a book entitled Green Worlds in Early Modern Italy, Art and the Verdant Earth of the Renaissance. But now we are here to launch her latest book, Woodland Imagery. Leopoldine, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Well, I would like to begin by thanking you and and Joost for your encouragement. That meant an awful lot to me. And then, of course, I would like to welcome and thank our audience, including friends, scholars, etc. I'm so pleased that you are all here to talk about my book. Woodland Imagery in Northern Art. I would like to start talking about the cover. Unfortunately, the colors are a little darker than I would have wished, but it is a painting by Jacob van Ruisdael, known the world over as one of the great painters of the Dutch landscape in the 17th century. And I chose this particular painting by him, not so much for aesthetic reasons, but for the enactment, that is the word, for the enactment, a tragedy between suffering in the form of the willow, basically pollarded to within an inch of his life, and a beautiful leafy tree in summer glory, and that would be the consolation. So suffering and consolation, the enactment of suffering and consolation is what makes this such a wonderful work for me.
You want the next slide? If you just go with your mouse on the PowerPoint.
Oh, there I go.
Yes.
But now I have something.
Or I can do it for you if you want. No, there you are. You did it.
Okay. So what I'm showing you here is a drawing, a pen drawing by a man called. But where are the captions of the image? Stein. Ah, there we are.
I think that this caption just lost, but the rest of the captions are there. Look, yeah, the rest of the captions are there. So
Okay.
Only one is missing.
Okay, so what I'm showing you here is a drawing by Domenico Campagnola, who was an associate of Titian, who in Venice was the first painter to take trees seriously. And you can see in this drawing, what Campagnola gives us is a beautiful a pastoral landscape, but the focus is on something called the copse. And the copse is a plantation of small diameter trees, a common feature in the pre-industrial landscape, and it wasn't there just to be a lovely aesthetic item in the landscape, but it was useful. The environment around human settlements from very early on would be littered with copses, rich with copses. And why? Because these stands of trees, you see the beautiful small diameter stems rising up, were the main raw material for everyday life in early societies. Yet we also have a tradition, gem of silviculture, that they are charming features for a lyrical experience. And in a similar way, I'm showing you here Leonardo's cups. And again, it is discussed for its aesthetic appeal, for the way in which he used red chalk to delineate these little stems rising from the ground, and then these high-top trees, the foliage sort of almost losing its materiality in pools of light. So as an art historical subject, but for him, it was probably also the record of a little stand of wood, of a copse, of a little wood that would eventually be cut down. It would be felled. So I just offering an aspect of this drawing that is not usually part of the art historical discourse. And to give you a further image in art history of the importance of this sylviculture, woodmanship in everyday life, I'm showing you this painting by Peter Bruegel, one of his great landscapes, and it's the season of late winter when where a copse, another stand of trees that have been lopped to grow higher and higher, to give the kind of timber that is needed for society. And just as the plow is sort of the symbol for the advancement of human history through agriculture, I am showing you here the billhook, a gleaming object in Peter Bruegel's painting, as the emblem of silviculture, which some believe is even older as a human activity than agriculture. And this is the famous painting by Hobbema, known the world over. And really what Hobbema presents here in this fascinating painting, Hobbema, a Dutch landscape painter at the same time, more or less, as Ruisdael, but he shows us an avenue of elder trees that have been lopped to grow higher and higher and higher to give us a fine crop of super slender trees. So again, art history, but knowing about the silviculture that lies behind it makes it even more interesting. Now the topic that what I'm showing you here is a painting at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, deemed to be one of his the greatest pastoral by Claude Lorrain in the United States. Claude Lorrain, working basically a contemporary of Ruisdael, but working in Rome, and he's really celebrated as the master of the filled landscape. And this is the great example, as I said, in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. But the point that I want to make is the loss of verdancy. The picture is very dark. When you are in the room at the Metropolitan Museum with these paintings by Claude, there's little interest because the paintings have gotten so dark. And so it's much easier to read the original painting by looking at Claude Lorrain's Ricordo. That is a drawing that he made after he painted the painting. And we can then really appreciate the river landscape, the clump of trees, which would have been brilliant in its verdancy, the leaning poplar seeking some sort of a contact with the little copse on the other side. And I'm showing you then also as an example of Lorrain's mastery in sylvan imagery, this splendor, I call it the lofty tree. And I just would like you to sort of imagine what this would have looked like. This ascent from penman work at the bottom, 3 little stems rising up. And then as we go higher and higher, again, the loss of materiality in these precincts of lights. That is the sun-drenched upper part of this foliate tree. To just imagine that in the brilliant colors of Claude's paintings. So the next subject then is the idea of the Kindle's promise. The Kindle, of course, has this logo. We are all familiar with it. And the argument that I make is that to be under a certain tree, sub quadam arbore, is an old literary trope, and it goes all the way back to the first line of Latin poetry by Virgil. And you see it here in an early manuscript. The shepherd poet does his work, is inspired, finds the comfort to do his poetry under a branching tree. And that miniature of the 4th century, the line by Virgil of just in the days of Augustus, and then its persistence into this logo for the Kindle, which has made reading a pleasure for so many people. I also wanted to show you with this slide the emancipation of trees in art. You just look on the left. During the Middle Ages, trees were just tiny little items, pint-sized in the medieval imagination, where, of course, the lofty tree by Lorrain is a kind of a Baroque, majestic manifestation of what a tree can look like. In this slide, I draw attention to Albrecht Dürer, who particularly loved the linden tree, and he has portrayed the linden tree as he saw it in his environment in the city of Nuremberg, where he pursued his career. And what he gives us is actually a tree portrait. One is the tree on the bastion, and you see it's rather slender stamped, but then it supports this enormous conical mass of leaves. And this shape, this kind of triangular conical shape, is very typical of the linden tree, which in the summer has a profusion of little heart-shaped leaves, and he depicts another lime tree on the outskirts of Nuremberg. These are really the great moments in the history of art of tree portraiture. There is a saying, homo arbor, which translates say tree and you say man, or say man and you say tree. And this applies then to depictions of trees as if they were suffering people. And this idea is you find it in poetry wherever you go. And I'm just giving you some lines of Cowper, an English poet at the end of the 18th century, who begins his big poem on an oak tree, the Yardley oak, with these appellations, these epithets: survivor soul, and hardly such of all that once lived there, a shattered veteran, etc., etc. And of course, artists love to convey, to use their penmanship, as Lambert Domer here, or maybe Roland Savary. They both did this, of a tree that is uprooted truly at the end of his life, and signaling, of course, that the viewer too at some point will come to the end of his life and become an old dotard, that is, an old dotard of a hollow willow. In Rembrandt's doodle, I sort of was drawn to Rembrandt's doodle. You see his beret, you see his forehead and his eyes, but then you also see a small man in front of foliage, of a high-topped foliate tree, and then some strands of hair. And it seems to me that this is a reference to an axiom by the great art critic Karel van Mander, that when it comes to depicting leaves and hair, it's all spirit. It's no longer an intellectual exercise of disegno. And so it sort of fits our discussion here of trees in art. And forest interior as a sovereign object becomes popular in the late 16th century, when we see the work of Jan Breugel the Elder, among others, who really makes sylvan imagery, woodland imagery, the hallmark of his paintings. And again, it's almost like as if we were looking at Claude Lorrain's painting. We have this multi-tiered, fantastic tree foliant in summer glory, and then again we have this little spot of invitation for the reader. I was going to talk about this painting, but I'm afraid that I'm running out of time, so we'll talk about that at some other time. But Down by the Riverside explores the reedy colors of the river, the stands of reeds that sort of occupy this place that is neither quite water nor is it fully earth. And then, of course, what you're seeing here is the depiction of such a reed color by Jan Breugel in a collaborative painting with Rubens. Then Rubens' Testament, and I'm referring here to one of the two great landscapes that he painted at the end of his life just for himself. And that's why I call it a testament. It displays his art, how his art is often an expression of natural philosophy. But I want to draw attention in particular. So here is this is early morning. We see his headstone, the place, his little castle where he lives in retirement, and then the enormous panorama of a Brabant polder somewhere. But the focus really is on the stump of the really moldy stump of a tree that once stood along the road here to give its shade, but it has been blasted, it has fallen down, and it is proliferating now, all sorts of thorns and brambles, which were fascinating to Rubens and botanists in his time, as examples, which they thought so, of kind of regeneration. How does nature follow decay, and then find ways to regenerate itself. And sort of that is sort of manifest then here in this little tree, which I think is sort of a little ego document by Rubens, and it's invaded by the thorns and brambles in the foreground, and you see here a sort of Rubens' interest in the drawings, the naturalist drawings by Leonardo, and you see these wonderful studies of brambles, and art historians have studied Rubens' study of Leonardo's drawings, and so here. I show you a drawing by Leonardo, a fantastic drawing here of a fallen tree invaded by thorns and brambles, basically held upright by the invaders, already completely out, without, no longer situated into the earth. And then, of course, I have this little tree and the brambles here in this landscape. And there are people who think that Rubens identified with brambles not because they are subject in the art of Leonardo, but because he, a red-headed man, sort of associated with the plant, Rubus fructicosus, a plant that yields red berries and is enormously fruitful in the countryside. And so here is sort of a summation of the various works that I've talked about. And that's it. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Pauline. We're going to keep the questions for later onwards, so please put all your questions in the chat. But this was a fascinating presentation of a fascinating book. I will give the floor to Joost, but first I would like to present him to you. Joost Keizer, a reference today. Actually, he's someone who every talk I have with him is inspiring again and again. So I'm really happy that he is here now to give his thoughts on the book. Joost is associate professor in the history of art at the University of Groningen and has just become the vice dean of his faculty. Joost wrote his PhD at Leiden University on Michelangelo and the Politics of Art, and published the PhD later as a book by Yale University Press. Before Groningen, he worked at Yale and Columbia University. And besides his work on Michelangelo, he has published on, among other Italian artists, Piero della Francesca, Leonardo, and Artemisia. One of his latest publications is the article Temporalities of Early Modern Signatures in Res Anthropology and Aesthetics. Joost, thank you very much for being here. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Stijn, for the introduction. Thanks for inviting me. And thank you, Pauline, for writing a fantastic book that I would have read later, I think, but came in touch with now, really at the time also when I was thinking about trees. I was sitting in front of a tree just a few minutes ago, but then decided that the counter light was just too much. You couldn't see me. Big linden tree that's growing in the courtyard of our faculty. I'm in my office. What Leopoldine does so beautifully in her book is to show what art is capable of, also is capable of doing at times when its subject is not flourishing. Reading your chapters, I became aware of the fact that what has always been considered as a kind of realist topos, landscape, trees, is in fact a poetics. Purely a thinking about what trees do, how trees relate to human beings, what you can do in the shadow of a tree, rather than using the trees for life, right? Cutting them to pieces, felling them, building houses off of them. In the period that you talk about, early modern Northern Europe, the 16th through the 18th century, a little bit of 15th even, was a time in which trees in Europe were beginning to disappear. Quite slowly and not in every place at the same pace. They weren't disappearing everywhere. At the same time, across the ocean where you are now, Pauline, trees were flourishing, right? There's a lot of recent research on what happened after 2/3 of the South American populations died, and trees took over, right? A sort of third stage in ecological succession. The trees take over places where humans once were. And I've been thinking a lot about these kind of things happening also in the artworks that you discuss and in the kind of poetics that you bring to the fore for the first time, I think. It's a real sort of shift in thinking about landscape. That's how I read the book. I put a couple of slides together that talk about trees disappearing as a kind of sort of background to your book about deforestation. Also to see how special your book actually is. I was reminded of that famous quote in Pliny, who served in the Roman army. He went all the way up to Germany in the Roman legion. So he had seen the sort of wild forests there in Germany. And he wrote of this vast expanse of the Herinian oak forest, untouched by the ages, he says, and coeval with the world, which surpasses all marvels by its almost immortal destiny. And it's these kinds of quotes, together with Tacitus, who also writes about Northern Europe and the forests over there, that must have inspired people like Dürer and others. People who knew that there once was, where they lived, this vast forest that was coeval with the world, right? That was timeless, unchanging, and unchangeable. And that changed that idea, right? In the middle of sort of the period that you talk about, began to change. This is the frontispiece of a book published by Abraham Goos, Amsterdam printmaker, 1616, where he writes about the Ardennes woods, the Ardennen, that had shrunk because of the timber industry, housing and other kinds of buildings that humans used, right? When the populations were growing, the trees were shrinking. Omander talks about hard oak planks imported from Norway, right? There's the kinds of wood that northern painters painted on did not come from Europe itself, some exceptions. Goos also talks about the Sonian forest, still there, which had shrunk to 8,000 acres in his time. It's now 2,000 acres bigger because it's a UNESCO forest, it's protected. Also, as Goos emphasized there in 1616, because Albrecht of Austria felled 100 acres annually. He also mentions what the timber produced in terms of money, in terms of income. And then there's Ludovico Guicciardini, who came from Italy, lived in Antwerp for a while, traveled through the Netherlands, and he talked about the fact, interestingly enough, a fact that we see in other sources too, that in the Netherlands, where you would have soft peat grounds and a lot of water, as you know, trees would appear, would emerge from those peat grounds, from the inland bodies of water, these big oak trees would all of a sudden surface, and they were testament to the big forests that covered that part of Europe, also the Netherlands, right? And people imagined that this was the origins of their place, that it was wooded. People in Haarlem imagined that they were descendants from followers of Bacchus, who lived there in the midst of enormous trees, oak trees, and grapes, and all of that. So I thought also, when I was reading the book, I thought it's also kind of historical poetics, right, that we have there, the kind of disappeared world. Maybe not so much for Dürer, but for many of them, the forest disappeared also for the Italians. Then there's Van Mander, who was acutely aware of the fact that forests had disappeared, at least before his time. And when he talks about Jan van Scorel, this is one of my favorite Jan van Scorel pictures in the Rijksmuseum, who in the afternoons on Sundays and feast days, he usually went outside the city walls of Haarlem, where there was, at the time, a pleasurable wood. And he imitated the trees with colors very naturally and lightheartedly, unlike the common means of other painters. So this is Van Scorel, who goes out into the woods, the Haarlemmer Hout, I think he means. And that was much bigger than it used to be in Van Mander's time. And if you read Van Mander on landscape, then you get the sense even that he's founding landscape anew. He also uses that word to found, stichten. As if the trees were gone. There's a passage when he talks about this is the forest, the bos that is here on the map by Thomas. It's a late 16th century map that is kept in the Noord-Hollands Archief, and other sources in that same archive also talk about the destruction of that same forest, the woods that Van Scorel went to in 1572 and 3, when the Spaniards were outside the city wall, camped there outside the city wall, and they completely felt all of the trees, destroyed the whole Haarlemmer Hout, which was a kind of memories of that moment you can still find in sources. And what happens around that time is that humans start to take over from nature. They start planting trees. And that's also what we find in those sources, that to the pleasure of the citizens of Haarlem, that now vacant plot of land would be replanted. And those kinds of formulations we find more often around 1600, that trees are there for pleasure, right? Not just for timber. So it's that same kind of poetics, I think, that might have come out of painting, right? It's not unthinkable that painting produced the kind of poetics of trees that then was imitated by people in real life. When Van Mander talks about Gillis van Koningslo, he has this amazing passage about Gillis having the trees, making the trees grow in Holland. He says, in short, and according to my opinion of his artful works, I don't know any better maker of landscapes, and see how his way of working is increasingly followed in Holland, right? These dark forests that Gillis painted that he had inherited from the Frankenthaler school. And the trees that here stood rather withered, and he's still thinking about all the trees that are gone, and the trees that are there around 1604 when Van Mander is writing are still small. They were all replanted after 1483 around Haarlem where Van Mander is writing. And the trees that here stood rather withered began to grow after his, as much as they considered appropriate, although some farmers and planters would deny it. So it's the planters, the people who are replanting trees, who are saying to Van Mander and other painters that that's not really how trees grow. But what Gilles is doing, I thought, after reading your book, Pauline, is that he's thinking about what these dense forests used to look like around Amsterdam where he's working. And then I have two last slides by Hercules Segers, who is, who was born in Haarlem, who was there, part of the culture of Van Mander. He's young when the trees are beginning to grow again in Haarlem, and he's fascinated by tree stumps. Right, he's sort of the antidote to your book, Pauline. He's there's hardly any sort of big growing tree in the landscapes that he's etching. So you have these there's a tree stump over here, and there are more tree stumps over there. It's all felled, it's all down. And Segers is he's historically very precise kind of artist. I think it's very much of his time. He's a ruin of a kind of old convent prince that is in the British Museum in London. And that has this beautifully growing tree that we know that Segers is famous for, right? But then also there's a tree trunk over here that rises up, and then slats are hammered against that. And there's a piece of timber over here, so human-produced wood. And then this second kind of tree trunk that seems to be leaning against that part over here. So it's trees regrowing, it's nature taking over. Right here, it's the drift sand coming into the dunes, just like Brederode Castle at the time. But it's also trees that have been destroyed. And I think that people like Segers and Van Mander were also, they were in the know about the Spanish having felled all of the woods around Haarlem that you see people talking about in the archives, in the documents. And I thought that this would be a sort of antidote to your book, Pauline, also, because it would open the kind of discussion that I think your book also raises, is that coordination with how people imagined what nature should be like, right? How it should be imagined, what it could be, and the kind of reality that you sometimes find in other artists, like Segers. So that was a real sort of eye-opener for me. So the article I was writing over the summer, I haven't submitted yet. It was done, but I had to incorporate your book. That's the short story. So thanks for that. This is, I think, the end of my presentation. It's not the full 20 minutes, but I hope it's enough.
No worries. It was more than enough. It was a real good and very thorough reflection on where the latest book of Pauline is really standing in that larger field of the interest in ecology in early modern period and the representation of nature in this concern. Maybe I give the floor to Leopoldine before we will address the questions in the chat to briefly react on the talk of Joost.
Yes, of course. The antithesis between a charming environment, I mean, trees as essential to a charming environment. Trees, of course, are also essential to a distressed environment. And I think this is beautifully laid out by Joost in the various examples. And then in terms of the ecology, I think we can do so much in the future, trying to developing ecological frameworks for what it is that we see, all the many artistic testaments that have been left for us in the art of the Dutch Republic and beyond. So we have a lot of work ahead of us.
What is also interesting, and what combines both of your talks, is that look in kind of a memory way of how it was, kind of, but also kind of a heritage. Like we have to keep these trees, these forests, as something that belongs to our identity. Even is that going too far, saying that? So just as of course the Dutch, for example, presented themselves in marines and their identity, the same could be said maybe in Ruisdael's depictions of forests, of landscapes.
Do you mean to say this Homo arbor axiom that
Actually, I want to broaden it a bit with that idea of heritage, that it belongs to us, that it belongs to our past. So forests combined with the idea of heritage, actually.
I think that if we start to look for testimonies, the whole wide ocean of Dutch literature, I think we'll find, and art, we'll find a lot of tree imagery that is almost like an eco document.
Right. I go to the questions in the chat. I just read them aloud. The first one is by Astrid Luipaert. Thank you for your presentation. Since prehistory, there are examples of trees used as places for spirituality, like nail trees and ribbon trees. The artworks you talked about have often a non-explicit form of spirituality, but do you know examples of paintings from the Renaissance with this sort of explicit spiritual admiration, worshipping of trees? It's very difficult to study these practices, as there are often no traces left, but maybe paintings can learn us more about if these practices took place, and if yes, how.
Well, I do have a project in my mind about the hazelaar, the hazel tree, which was with us basically from the moment that the Ice Age withdrew the first pioneer trees, the birches and the hazels, and they, of course, became enormous resources for raw material for the advancement of mankind, or whatever you want to call it. And I think I have quite a little library of depictions of the hazel tree and the hazel cups, that little cups that I showed by Campagnola most likely was a hazel cup. Virgil talks about the hazel as a place of lyrical, as a lyrical place. So I think an awful lot can be done with trees as a whole range of identities that are significant for mankind. Not just as, not just as works of nature.
Yes, thank you. Jos, would you like to add to this? This question about spirituality and trees, and the visualization of that kind of spirituality.
I was reading the answer that Larry Silver gave in the chat. I looked for that too in my own research, and there is a lot in Chris Wood's book on Aldover, for instance. There's also a revival of all of that in the course of the 17th century, when Catholicism is really chased out of the cities in Northern Europe, and there's a kind of natural spirituality revival that the Protestants then also try to suppress again. There's a lot of it, and of course those little country tabernacles that you would find everywhere, right? At Breugel paints. Yeah. They're often timbered to nailed to trees.
Yes. All right, thank you. Thank you. Also, sorry, do add.
I just really wanted to add this on the sacredness of trees. This story of Ruisdael, the great mystic, who receives who experiences mysticism underneath a fiery tree in the Zonienwoud. And I think that must have been in the minds of so many people,
Yes.
because he had a tremendous
Influential.
influence.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. So thank you, Larry, for reminding us of that joke of Oscar Wilde about landscapes, nature, copies, art. Caroline had a question. Thank you for your presentation. When you showed Rubens's painting of his castle with a panorama, it made me wonder if these paintings express an opposition between nature and culture, or more of an ideal combination of nature and culture. According to you, do paintings like the one of Rubens aim to bring us closer to nature, or to illustrate the differences?
Why did Rubens paint this landscape? I think he, as a natural philosopher, was deeply interested in the problem of regeneration. And I think I mentioned that he turned to thorns and brambles, because as soon as a tree is felled, naturally or by human hand, the thorns and the brambles go right in there and renew the process of growth, of producing wood in whatever form it is. And I think that was of great interest to him. This wood in nature tells us something, or reveals something about the promise of regeneration. I don't know, maybe that's too vague, but I think it's a philosophical, that's why I call it Rubens's Testament. It's a philosophical statement.
Yes, indeed. Stefan Bartila, sorry. I'm not so sure if this responds to a previous question. Gilles Mostard painted a painting with the falling of a holy oak, so that will be maybe referred to Astrid's question, an oak of Ceres, story from Ovid's Metamorphoses. And Max Schaffel's question: thank you for an excellent presentation, Leopoldine. Looking forward to picking up your book and re-examining Van Ruisdael already. With regards to your note on brambles and or the underbush and its regenerative qualities, do you think this would also have been related poetically by artists to the religious notion of the resurrection?
The living wood, absolutely. I think it is the great theme for the Catholic Church, for Catholic thought. The thing is that it didn't really, during the Middle Ages, it didn't really develop into interest in real trees. It was an emblem. But it's a mystery. It was an emblem of something totally mysterious, that from the dead wood we get a revival and revitalization to living wood.
Thank you. And then Larry Silver brings in a reply on Astrid. The German tradition of Altdorfer, in particular, as discussed by Christopher Wood, moves close to an explicit discussion of dense forests as sites of spirituality, tied also by Tacitus to the worship of primitive Germans. So that's something to add to what we already responded to the question. Then, of course, I have my own questions ready, Leopoldine. I loved so much that one. I go back to it. That one etching. It is, if I'm correct, by Rembrandt, or was it an engraving?
It's an etching.
It's an etching. Yeah.
So you find
where is it? Yes, there it is. I find it for you. Yeah. Can you elaborate on that? Because it is such a fascinating. You would actually think that kind of stuff is for drawings, not just to do something and to combine. But it's such an amazing, strange etching we have here. How to give that more interpretation and how to relate it then to Van Mander. If you can elaborate a bit on that, it would be great.
I suppose I've talked both. Rubens puts himself into his art, and certainly Rembrandt. I try to analyze what kind of tree he presents here. and one of the things that I can notice is when you have one branch that sticks out of the tree, that is a commonplace. It's very often called a stag head because it's like the horns of a stag as he appears above the foliage of trees. And then, of course, it's also a study of light and dark. But in terms of, I don't know where to go from what I've just said, really. If anybody can help me, that would be great. It's obviously, I think, in some ways, an ego document, just
Yes.
as we saw in Rubens's painting.
Yeah. And but also the medium, the etching, instead of what we would expect to be a drawing. I would think that, of course, we see it's clearly an etching. Of course, I'm not denying that. But why is he using this medium? You think it's, of course, just a question that cannot be clearly answered.
Yeah, maybe the scratching of the needle. I just don't know.
It's fascinating. It's a fascinating image for me. Thank you very much for this presentation. B.E. Mandre writes, I can't wait to read the book once my uni library will receive it. Just ordered it. I was wondering, have you considered the other side of the coin, namely a kind of poetics of horror that the woodland could offer in the early modern imagery? Sylvan landscapes, such as the Sotoboski by Otto Marseus van Schriek, for instance. It would be interesting to have your opinion. Thanks. All the best and lots of success for your book. So this is actually how to do the Sotobosco of how to relate that into your story, the Sotoboski of, for example, Otto Marseus van Schriek and the horror it rises.
Absolutely. I will have to read some more poetry.
It would be quite the opposite than that regenerative force. I think it's more the death that's represented there with the typical animals that is related to the negative side of the nature.
I think a whole book could be filled with how sylvan imagery of any kind illustrates, almost like a psychological horror.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know whether Freud has done anything with it. I don't know. But there is an ego document and self-identification going on, I think, between what you see in nature, what we see in art, and what goes on in our mind.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, there have been done splendid work on Otto Marseus van Schriek, relating him to the biology avant la lettre, the natural sciences, but not so much relating him to poetry. Mm-hmm. Would that be a new angle in order to better understand his work?
Marseus Schriek?
Yes.
I would love to look, to think about it and to see if there is a poetics of words that would match the poetics of his vision.
Yes. Something to add, Joost, to one of the previous questions?
No, not really.
Then there's already another remark.
There's enough about horror and the forest, right? I mean, there's a lot of dark.
Is that so? Who writes about that?
Just what you find in chronicles about what people say when they have to move through dense forests.
Yes.
Right. So it's relatively safe to travel through fields and all that and small woods, but dense forests are very dangerous. And so some cities pride themselves on being surrounded by safe forests.
Right.
Maybe we should reread Simon Schema's.
Yeah.
Landscape and Memory.
Yes.
Mm-hmm. All right, there's another remark by April Uttinger. In response to the question about etching, so the Rembrandt question, I wonder whether the additive nature of the etching process is comparable to an index of the organic and temporal nature of trees and their growth.
Oh,
Would that be something to better
I
understand?
think that his pen is really, I think it's a great question, is 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 creating a trajectory that is human life to some degree. You know, there are these knot holes where a branch was taken off by storm or by human hand. There is a branch that is just felt. It's just, you can see that it's been cut off. And then there is a lot of die-off as well as a continuation of the effort to reach the light, because that's a tree's job, is to reach the light. And then, of course, that culminates on one hand in this kind of negative space of immateriality when light hits the foliage. And then on the left, there is a dead end.
Thank you.
Yeah, I can treat it as a human, as an emblem, I know, as an image, a visual poem on what it means to be human.
All right, thank you. A question by Luis Zamora. I'm interested in your concept of ego document, Pauline. Do you feel that this concept applies to other images to tree images in ways that other images do not?
The ego document, which I think I once read a book or an article that it was very much part of a Calvinist's life. He had to write down what he has done, or the good and the evil in his life, and that is the ego document. So it sort of is a cultural phenomenon. Now, trees certainly can stand for the human being, and you're asking me, are there other items that could stand for the human being in ways that are comparable? I would have to really think about that. I mean, see what features of the earth can afford the same kind of comparison or analog or metaphor. But I'm sure if we look for it, we can find it. But the tree is so universal, and hopefully will remain around us, that it seems to be the best emblem in nature to make thoughts about what it means to be human.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Then a remark by Amy Bellani. Just in case this passed by, the Harvard Art Museum had a summer exhibition of Dutch drawings and a catalogue, Crossroads, that explored the land as ravaged around 1600 by the wars and overgrazing. That's Joanna Zederstein and Suzanne Anderson. So that's interesting to bring that in. I don't know if you want to reflect on that, to respond on that, Leopoldine or Joost.
Well, I think Dutch art has given us many images of devastation, of wasteland, of woestenij. I think it's an ongoing drama, has been from the very beginning with our hazel trees and birch trees, down to what's happening now. I think in the end, it's all an ecological drama. Whether I read poetry, whether I look at nature, whether I read my books, it's all an ongoing drama.
It's a bit a sad note to end this book launch.
Well, everybody can go home and plant a few trees.
Yes, we can, like boys did, huh? So in that way, we can also make that into a work of art, like a performance of planting those trees, as boys did in Kassel. One of those very contemporary, or at least post-war artists in their performing arts did. So in that way, it can be that also art can point us at that ecological drama, and let's hope that will turn us to better views and better ways of dealing with nature. And I think that certainly this kind of historical approaches are also helping us and getting us a better view of how in previous ages artists try to deal visually and, of course, also in texts with our relation to ecology, and then the drama it can indeed form. So thank you so much, Leopoldine, for the beautiful book, but also most interesting book and nice presentation. Joost, you too. Thank you very much for bringing that the other perspectives into the book and into the field of environmental humanities, we call it now. So thank you very much, both of you. I really liked the launch, and I learned a lot. All right, the rest of you, we will record this so you can always look back at it. And you will also have all the information of the other events we will organize. Thank you very much for being here and hope to see you very, very soon. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.